If for 5575, 11 things to let go of after this age. Have you ever woken up and wondered, where did the years go? Life moves so fast, and before we know it, we're carrying decades of habits, worries, and expectations that no longer serve us. The truth is, reaching 55, 60, or even 70 isn't about slowing down, it's about freeing yourself. But here's the catch. To truly embrace this stage, you have to let go of the things that are secretly weighing you down. Think about it. How much of your energy is spent stressing over things you can't change, chasing things that don't bring real joy, holding on to relationships, regrets, or routines that drain you? What if I told you that by letting go, you could open the door to more peace, more fulfillment, and a life that feels lighter than ever before? In this video, we'll uncover 11 things you must let go of to truly enjoy the years ahead, things that steal your happiness, rob your health, and keep you stuck in the past. Some may surprise you, some may even be hard to hear, but I promise you this, by the end you'll see your life in a whole new way. Stay with me, and let's take this journey together. And if you find these insights meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin. 1. Let go of working for the sake of working. Lao Tzu once said, "Do you have the patience to wait until your mud settles and the water is clear?" The great sages understood something we often forget. Relentless striving does not always bring fulfillment. In ancient China, an old farmer lost his horse, and the villagers pitied him. "Such bad luck," they said, but the farmer simply replied, "Who knows if it is good or bad?" Soon the horse returned with a dozen wild ones, making the farmer wealthier than before. The lesson? Sometimes what seems like a loss is a hidden blessing. Many of us, deep into our working years, fear stepping away, as if stopping would mean losing something. But what if, like the farmer, we are making space for something greater, peace, joy, and time well spent? There was a man I once knew, let's call him Walter. Walter spent his life building a name for himself. He started working in his 20s, climbed the corporate ladder, and by the time he reached 60, he had it all. A big house, a successful career, and enough money to retire comfortably. But there was one problem. Walter didn't know how to stop. Even after his retirement party, he kept showing up at the office, lingering around like a ghost of his former self. "I just want to stay useful," he'd say with a nervous chuckle. His wife Marilyn begged him to travel with her, to spend time with their grandkids, to finally live the life they had put off for someday. But Walter always had an excuse. He had spent so many years working that he had forgotten how to be anything else. Without the constant grind, he felt irrelevant. Society had taught him that a man's worth was measured by his productivity, his usefulness, his ability to keep going, and so he kept going. Until one day, his body made the decision for him. A heart attack struck him down at his desk, his former desk. He survived, but he was never the same. Sitting in that hospital room, hooked up to machines, he realized that the world had moved on without him. The job went on, the company hired someone younger, the emails kept coming, but they were no longer his to answer, and in that moment, Walter faced a terrifying truth. He had traded his time for something that could never love him back. He spent the rest of his days trying to reclaim what he had lost. Long walks with his wife, lazy afternoons with his grandchildren, the simple pleasure of waking up with nothing urgent to do. But time, once gone, doesn't return. He learned too late that true wealth isn't in numbers or titles, it's in moments. It's in the people who hold your hand when you're too weak to hold on to anything else. I've seen too many Walters in my lifetime. Good men, hard-working men, men who believed they were doing the right thing by dedicating their lives to work. And yet, on their deathbeds, none of them wished they had spent more time at the office, not one. So tell me, my friends, what are you still holding on to? Have you, like Walter, convinced yourself that work is the only thing that gives you value? Or have you already stepped into the freedom that comes with letting go? Let me know in the comments, what is one thing you've stopped chasing that has brought you peace? I'd love to hear your wisdom. 2. Let go of mindless spending. The Stoic philosopher Seneca once warned, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more who is poor." In ancient Rome there was a wealthy merchant named Gaius who spent his life accumulating riches, gold, fine silks, extravagant feasts. But when a fire consumed his estate, he was left with nothing. Desperate, he sought comfort among his servants, only to realize that he had never built true friendships. While they had each other, he had only possessions, now reduced to ashes. True wealth, he learned too late, is not measured in what we own, but in the relationships and peace of mind we cultivate. I once knew a woman named Evelyn. She was one of those people who had everything, at least everything that money could buy. She and her husband Charles built a successful business when they were young, and by the time they reached their 60s they were financially secure. But Evelyn had a habit, one she never questioned. She bought things. A lot of things. New clothes with the tags still on them, a kitchen full of fancy appliances she never used, boxes of trinkets stacked in the garage, forgotten and gathering dust. Shopping was her escape. A new dress made her feel important. A brand new car made her feel young. And expensive jewelry, well, that told the world that she had made it. Her husband Charles was different. He didn't care for fancy things. He wanted to downsize, to travel, to spend their golden years simply enjoying life. But Evelyn always had a reason to keep everything. What if I need it, she'd say. What if we ever have guests? But the guests never came. Then one day, Charles was gone. A sudden heart attack. Just like that, the man she had spent her entire life with was no longer there. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn looked around and saw her home for what it really was. A museum of things that no longer mattered. That night, she sat on their bed, holding one of his old sweaters. "I kept everything, Charlie," she whispered into the silence, "but none of it brings you back." The walk-in closet felt empty without her husband's laughter echoing from the other room. The fancy dishes sat unused on a dining table that no longer had anyone to sit at it. The house, once her pride, became a silent, suffocating space filled with reminders of everything she had collected and everything she had lost. One day she decided to sell most of it. The dresses, the furniture, the jewelry, all gone. With the money she took her grandchildren on a trip across the country, something Charles had always wanted to do. For the first time in years she felt free. "I wasted so much time buying things I didn't need," she told me once, "and when I finally let go I realized something. I never needed any of it. I just needed the people I loved." So tell me, have you ever looked around and realized that the things you own no longer serve you? Have you let go of something and found peace in the simplicity? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. 3. Let go of stressing over small things. The Buddha once said, "If the problem can be solved, why worry? If the problem cannot be solved, worrying will do you no good." In ancient India, a traveler carried 2 heavy sacks on his shoulders. An old sage saw him struggling and asked, "Why do you carry both?" The man replied, "One is filled with today's burdens, and the other with tomorrow's worries." The sage smiled and said, "Drop the second sack. You cannot carry what has not yet happened." The traveler hesitated, but eventually let it go, and for the first time in years, he walked freely. When I was younger, I had a friend named Margaret. Margaret was a worrier. If the weather forecast called for rain, she'd cancel plans. If her husband was 5 minutes late, she'd assume the worst. She spent half her life fretting over things that never even happened. I remember once, when we were in our 40s, we planned a weekend getaway with our families. It was supposed to be simple. 2 days at the lake, laughter, and a break from our busy lives. But Margaret couldn't enjoy a single moment. She worried about the food spoiling, about the kids getting sunburned, about whether the house had been locked before they left. Her husband Robert would smile and say, "Maggie, just breathe. The world isn't going to end if we forget a towel." But she never could. Then life did what life does. It threw the unexpected at her. At 60, Robert passed away suddenly, right there at the breakfast table. No warning, no time to prepare. Just gone. For months, Margaret barely spoke. She went through the motions, paying bills, grocery shopping, smiling politely when people offered condolences. Then, one day, she called me. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "I wasted so much time worrying," she said. "Robert always told me to breathe, to just enjoy things, and now? He's not here for me to enjoy anything with." She spent years stressing over burnt toast, misplaced keys, and messy schedules, things that, in the end, meant nothing. What she didn't realize was that the little moments, the ones she was too busy worrying through, were the important ones. After that call, she tried to change. She started saying yes to things she once avoided. She let the dishes sit in the sink if it meant spending an extra hour on the porch watching the sunset. She learned how to laugh again, really laugh, the kind that makes your belly ache and your eyes water. But she also knew she had learned the lesson too late. She would have given anything to go back and replace the worry with joy. And that's why I'm telling you this. Don't wait for life to teach you the hard way. Look at whatever is bothering you today and ask yourself, will this matter a year from now? If not, let it go. Have you ever let stress steal a moment you can never get back? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Maybe together, we can learn to breathe a little easier. 4. Let go of neglecting self-care. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, once said, "A wise man should consider that health is the greatest of human blessings." In ancient Greece, a renowned scholar named Demetrius was admired for his intellect but paid no attention to his body. He skipped meals, ignored rest, and scoffed at exercise, believing his mind was all that mattered. But when illness struck, his great wisdom couldn't save him. Lying on his deathbed, he realized that no amount of knowledge could replace lost health. "I spent my years feeding my mind," he lamented, "but I starved my body and soul." I once knew a woman named Lillian. If you met her, you'd think she was the strongest person in the world. She was the kind of woman who never sat down. She raised 4 children, worked 2 jobs, and made sure everyone around her was taken care of. If someone needed help, she was there before they even asked. But there was one person Lillian always forgot to take care of: herself. She never got enough sleep. She skipped meals or ate whatever was quick and easy. She had aches and pains that she ignored because there was always something more important to do. She told herself that once the kids were grown, once the bills were paid, once life settled down, then she would rest. But life doesn't wait at 62. Lillian had a stroke. It wasn't the kind that left her completely helpless, but it was enough to slow her down. Suddenly, the woman who had carried the weight of the world could barely carry herself across a room. She sat in a hospital bed, frustrated and confused. As doctors told her the truth, her body had been trying to warn her for years, but she had never listened. And here's the thing that haunted her the most. When she couldn't do any more, she realized something heartbreaking. The people she had spent her life taking care of, they still loved her, even when she couldn't be the one fixing everything. Her worth wasn't in what she did, it was in who she was. Everything. It took almost losing herself to understand that self-care wasn't a luxury. It wasn't selfish. It was the one thing that could have given her more time with the people she loved. After that, Lillian changed. She started walking every morning, even if it was slow. She took the time to cook real meals instead of grabbing something quick. She learned to say no when she needed to rest. And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to be cared for instead of just being the caregiver. I tell you this because I've seen it too many times. People running themselves ragged, believing they'll rest someday. But someday isn't promised. So tell me, have you been putting yourself last? Have you finally learned, like Lillian, that self-care isn't selfish? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. 5. Let go of overcommitting to others. Confucius once said, "He who chases 2 rabbits catches neither." In ancient China, there was a man who wanted to please everyone. He agreed to help a neighbor harvest his crops, promised to repair a friend's roof, and swore he would teach the village children. But as he stretched himself thin, his own farm fell into ruin, his home collapsed, and his health declined. When he could no longer help anyone, he realized that by saying yes to everything, he had lost himself. The lesson? A life spent pleasing others at the expense of your own well-being is a life half-lived. I knew a woman once, a dear friend named Joanne. She was the kind of person everyone relied on. If someone needed a last-minute favor, they called Joanne. If there was an event to plan, Joanne would take care of it. If anyone needed help, she was the first to volunteer. She told herself it was because she was a good person, and she was. But deep down, she also feared what would happen if she said no. Would people stop liking her? Would they think she was selfish? So she said yes to everything. For years, she filled her schedule with other people's needs. She stayed late at work to help colleagues finish their projects, even when it meant missing dinner with her husband. She hosted family gatherings she was too exhausted to enjoy. She spent her weekends running errands for others while her own laundry sat undone and her books remained unread. Then one day it happened. She crashed. It wasn't dramatic, no breakdown, no angry outburst, just an ordinary afternoon when she sat down on her couch, feeling so completely drained that she couldn't even get up. She stared at the wall, and for the first time in decades, she asked herself, "When was the last time I did something just for me?" She couldn't remember. At night? Joanne did something she had never done before. She turned off her phone. She let calls go to voicemail. She didn't reply to messages. And the world? It kept spinning. The next morning she did something even scarier. She started saying no, not to everything, just to the things that drained her, the things she did out of obligation rather than joy. And something remarkable happened. She felt lighter. The people who truly cared about her understood. The ones who were only there for what she could give, they disappeared. And that was okay. Joanne learned that saying no didn't make her a bad person. It made her a person who finally respected her own time, energy, and well-being. So tell me, have you ever struggled to say no? Have you ever felt trapped by the fear of disappointing others? Let's talk about it in the comments. Maybe it's time we all start choosing ourselves a little more often. 6. Let go of unhealthy relationships. The philosopher Epictetus once said, "The key is to keep company only with people who uplift you, whose presence calls forth your best." In ancient times, a wise man told his student to place a fresh apple among rotten ones. Within days, the fresh apple began to decay. "You see," the master said, "the company you keep will either nourish you or poison you. Choose wisely." We often hold on to relationships out of habit, fear, or obligation, even when they drain us. But like that fresh apple, our environment shapes us. And if we're surrounded by negativity, we too will begin to wither. I once knew a woman named Eleanor. She was warm, giving, and loyal to a fault. The kind of person who would drop everything if you needed her. And yet, for most of her life, she carried a burden, one that wasn't hers to carry. Her oldest friend Miriam had been in her life since childhood. They had history, shared secrets, and memories spanning decades. But as the years passed, something changed. Miriam became bitter, always complaining, always demanding. She never celebrated Eleanor's joys but expected Eleanor to sit through every one of her grievances. If Eleanor was happy, Miriam found a way to dim her light. If Eleanor needed support, Miriam made the moment about herself. Still, Eleanor stayed. Why? Because they had been friends for so long. Because she felt guilty. Because she thought real friends don't abandon each other. But one day, everything became clear. Eleanor's daughter had just given birth to a baby boy, her first grandchild. It was a moment of pure joy, a new chapter in her life. She called Miriam, excited to share the news. But before she could even finish her sentence, Miriam interrupted with, "Must be nice, my life is a disaster." And just like that, something inside Eleanor shifted. She finally saw it, not just this moment, but all the moments where her happiness had been dismissed, where her kindness had been exploited, where she had been nothing more than an emotional dumping ground. For the first time she asked herself, what am I holding on to? Was it friendship, or was it just a habit she was too afraid to break? That night she made a decision. She didn't call Miriam back. She didn't explain herself, she simply let go. And the most surprising thing, the world didn't end. The guilt she feared never came. Instead, she felt lighter, as if she had set down a heavy suitcase she had been dragging for years. She poured her love into the people who truly cared, her family, her real friends, the ones who celebrated her, not drained her. If there's one thing life has taught me, it's this: you cannot save someone who refuses to save themselves. And you do not owe anyone your happiness. So tell me, have you ever held on to a relationship for too long? How did you finally find the strength to walk away? Let's talk in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. 7. Let go of neglecting your health. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, once said, "If we could give every individual the right amount of nourishment and exercise, we would have found the safest way to health." In ancient Rome there was a general named Lucius who won many battles but neglected his body. He feasted, drank excessively, and scoffed at the idea of moderation. As he aged, his body weakened, and soon he could no longer even lift a sword. In the end, the warrior who had conquered lands was conquered by his own neglect. The lesson? No victory matters if your body is too weak to enjoy it. I once knew a man named Harold. He was the type who never got sick, at least that's what he told himself. He worked long hours, skipped meals, and brushed off the aches in his back as just part of getting older. Exercise? That was something other people did. He'd start taking care of himself later, when things slowed down, but later never came. One evening, at 67 years old, Harold collapsed in his living room, a heart attack. The same man who once prided himself on being too busy for doctor's visits now found himself in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines. His doctor stood at his bedside, shaking his head. "Harold, your body has been warning you for years. You just weren't listening." And that's when it hit him. All those times his wife had begged him to eat better. The gym membership he never used. The high blood pressure medication he ignored because he felt fine. He had spent his whole life taking care of his work, his finances, even his car. Yet, he had treated his own body as if it were an afterthought. When he was discharged, Harold had a choice: go back to his old ways or make a change. For the first time, he chose himself. He started small: a morning walk, a few healthier meals, cutting back on stress. It wasn't about perfection, it was about choosing to live. Now I tell you this not to scare you but to remind you your body is not invincible. Every small choice you make today, what you eat, how much you move, how well you rest, becomes your future reality. So, my friends, let me ask you, are you taking care of the one body you've been given? Or are you still telling yourself you'll do it later? Let me know in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. 8. Let go of procrastinating on personal goals. The Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu once said, "The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now." In ancient Japan, a man longed to become a master calligrapher but always told himself he was too old to start. One day he visited a wise teacher and asked, "How long will it take me to master this art?" The teacher replied, 10 years. The man sighed, "That is too long." The teacher smiled and said, "Then it will take 20. The lesson? The longer you wait, the more time you waste. The only real deadline is the one life gives you, and none of us know when that will be." I once knew a woman named Marjorie. She was sharp as a tack, always full of ideas, always talking about the things she wanted to do. She had always dreamed of writing a book. She had notebooks full of ideas, stories, and thoughts that she swore she would turn into something one day. But life, as it often does, got in the way. There were bills to pay, children to raise, responsibilities to keep up with. "I'll start next year," she would say. Then next year became 5 years, then 10. By the time she turned 70, her children were grown, her house was quiet, and she finally had time. But she sat at her desk, staring at a blank page, feeling that awful whisper, "Maybe I missed my chance." On afternoon, she met an old friend for coffee. She told him about her regret, how she wished she had started sooner. He just laughed and said, "Marjorie, if you start today, in a year you'll have a book. If you don't start, in a year you'll still have nothing." That hit her hard. She went home that night and wrote the first page, then the next. Some days it was just a paragraph, some days a few sentences, but she kept going. A year later, she held a finished manuscript in her hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And when she finally published it, something remarkable happened. People loved it. Readers told her how much her words meant to them. One woman even said, "I've always wanted to write, but I thought it was too late for me. Now, I think I'll start." Marjorie learned the truth. It is never too late to begin, but if you keep waiting, it will be too late to finish. So let me ask you, what dream have you been putting off? What have you been telling yourself you'll start someday? If not now, when? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear what you've been waiting to begin. Maybe today is the day you take that first step. 9. Let go of the fear of change. Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, once said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he is not the same man." In ancient India, a wise monk told his students a story of a bird that feared the wind. It clung to the same tree its entire life, afraid that if it let go, it would be lost forever. One day a storm tore the tree from the ground, forcing the bird to fly. Terrified at first, it soon realized something beautiful. It was never meant to stay in one place. The sky had always been waiting for it. I knew a man named Raymond. He had spent 40 years in the same job, living in the same town, surrounded by the same people. Routine was his comfort. He knew what to expect, and that made life feel safe. But life doesn't care about our need for safety. It changes anyway. At 65, Raymond retired. At first he thought it would be nice. No more deadlines, no more early mornings. But as the days stretched into weeks, something unsettling crept in. He felt lost. Without work, without his daily structure, he didn't know who he was anymore. He tried filling the time, watching TV, tinkering in the garage, reading the newspaper, but there was an emptiness he couldn't shake. He had spent his whole life believing that if he just stuck to what was familiar, he'd always be secure. But now, with no job to go to, no real hobbies, no new adventures, he felt like a ship stranded in still waters. Then, one afternoon, his granddaughter Lily came to visit. She was in college, excited about a semester abroad. "Aren't you scared?" he asked. She laughed. "Of course. But isn't that the point? If we never step into the unknown, we never grow." That night, Raymond lay awake, thinking about her words. Was it possible that he had spent his entire life resisting change, only to realize that the unknown wasn't the enemy, it was an invitation? The next morning he did something unexpected. He signed up for a community painting class, something he had secretly wanted to try for years. Then he booked a trip to a place he had always dreamed of seeing but never made time for, and for the first time in decades he felt something he hadn't in a long time: alive. Raymond learned that change isn't the end of something, it's the beginning. So tell me, my friends, have you ever resisted change, only to realize later that it was exactly what you needed? Let me know in the comments. Maybe it's time we all start embracing the unknown a little more. 10. Let go of irregular sleep patterns. The great Persian physician Avicenna once said, "A well-spent day brings happy sleep, and a well-spent life brings happy death." In ancient China, an emperor prided himself on working tirelessly, believing that sleep was for the weak. He burned candles late into the night, pushing his mind and body beyond their limits. But soon, his memory faded, his strength weakened, and his decisions became reckless. A wise healer told him, "A farmer does not exhaust the soil without allowing it to rest. Why do you exhaust your mind?" The emperor finally listened, learning too late that without rest, even the greatest minds crumble. I once knew a man named Edward. He was always the last one awake and the first one up, convinced that sleep was something he could cut corners on. "I'll sleep when I'm dead," he used to say with a chuckle. Of course, his wife Margaret had other ideas. "At this rate, you'll be dead sooner than you think," she'd snap, shaking her head as he sipped his third cup of coffee at midnight. For years, Edward survived on coffee, ambition, and a few hours of quality sleep, which mostly consisted of dozing off in front of the TV and waking up confused at 2 a.m. He worked late into the night, convinced that every extra hour awake made him more productive. Even after retiring, the habit stuck. He'd stay up watching reruns of old westerns, scrolling through news articles he'd forget by morning, and fixing things around the house that weren't actually broken. Sleep? That was for when there was nothing better to do. Then, the signs started. He began forgetting simple things: where he put his keys, a name he had known for years. His moods changed. He was irritable, snapping at Margaret for no reason. His body felt sluggish, and his energy faded faster than it used to. At first, he blamed it on age. "I guess this is just what getting older feels like." But then, at a routine doctor's visit, his physician asked, "How much sleep do you get?" Edward shrugged, admitting he rarely got more than 5 hours. The doctor sighed. "Edward, your body isn't breaking down because of age. It's because you're running it on empty." That night, for the first time in years, Edward decided to change. He set a bedtime. He turned off the screens. He even, after much protest, started drinking herbal tea instead of coffee before bed. "This tastes like hot grass," he grumbled. But Margaret just smiled and handed him another cup. And after just a few weeks, something remarkable happened. His mind felt clearer, his energy returned, and the world didn't feel so heavy. He learned that sleep wasn't a waste of time, it was the key to making the most of his time. So let me ask you, have you ever neglected your sleep, thinking you were getting more done, only to realize you were losing more than you gained? Let's talk in the comments. Maybe tonight is the night you finally give yourself the rest you deserve. 11. Let go of comparing yourself to others. The Greek philosopher Socrates once said, "He who is not content with what he has would not be content with what he wants." In an old fable, two men raced against each other for years, constantly measuring their worth by who ran faster. One day an elder asked them, "Where are you running to?" Neither had an answer. They had spent so long comparing, they forgot why they started. The lesson? When you live by comparison, you're never truly satisfied. The race never ends until you step off the track and start walking your own path. I knew a man named Thomas. He was a good man, a hard-working man, but he had one bad habit. He was always looking at someone else's life, wondering why it wasn't his. In his 30s, he compared jobs. Why did his coworker get the promotion while he stayed in the same position? In his 40s, he compared houses. His brother had a bigger one, a newer one. Maybe if I worked harder I'd have that too. In his 50s he compared children. In his 80s he compared children. His neighbor's son went to medical school, while his worked a modest job. Did I not push my kids enough? Decades passed, and comparison followed him like a shadow. Every achievement felt smaller because someone else's seemed bigger. Every joy was dimmed by the thought that someone somewhere had more. Then one day Thomas attended a funeral. A friend of his, Robert, had passed. Robert was not the wealthiest man, nor the most accomplished by society's standards. But at his funeral, the room was full. Friends, family, neighbors, people whose lives he had touched. They spoke of his kindness, his laughter, the way he made people feel valued. As Thomas stood there, something hit him. No one mentioned Robert's salary, his house, or his status. They only remembered who he was. For the first time in decades, Thomas felt something he hadn't expected: regret. He flashed back to a holiday dinner years ago, sitting with his brother, arguing over whose house had more square footage. He had been so focused on winning that conversation that he barely remembered what they talked about. What had any of it meant? That night, Thomas sat alone and reflected. Had he wasted his life chasing a version of success that never truly mattered? Had he spent too much time looking at others instead of appreciating his own blessings? For the first time he looked at his life without measuring it against anyone else's. He saw his wife still by his side. He saw his children, not doctors, not CEOs, but good people, with kind hearts. He saw a home that may not have been the biggest, but it was his, filled with memories no one could take away. And for the first time in years, he felt content. So tell me, my friends, have you ever fallen into the trap of comparison, only to realize that happiness was right in front of you all along? Let's talk in the comments. Maybe today is the day we finally start measuring our lives by joy instead of competition. As we go through life, we carry so much: expectations, regrets, habits that no longer serve us. But what if the secret to happiness isn't in holding on, but in letting go? Let go of the things that weigh you down. The fear, the stress, the unnecessary burdens. Make space for what truly matters: your health, your peace, the people who bring you joy. Because at the end of the day, life isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by how deeply we live. So, I'll leave you with this. What's one thing you're finally ready to let go of? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story, and if this message resonated with you, consider liking and subscribing. Not for the numbers, but because together we're building something real. A community that values a life well lived. Until next time, take care of yourself. You deserve it.